your mother from the holding center, you stated, "I am a 16-year-old blonde. Probably all I have to do is cry in front of the jury, and they're going to feel sorry for me. The court hereby imposes a minimum sentence of 25 years, which will have a maximum of 20."
For years, their family saw nothing but ordinary faces. Half the truth visible, the darker half hidden. Their motives stayed buried, whispered about but never understood. Then the courtroom stripped away the silence.
I want the world to know who did this. I know Scott killed his father.
Testimony exposed the father who turned on his own home, the girl whose logic fractured beyond recognition, and the brother investigators still struggle to explain. Piece by piece, their stories emerged, and their reactions to life sentences shocked everyone who witnessed them. Christopher Coleman. It wasn't the kind of town where you expected darkness to crawl in unnoticed. Columbia, Illinois felt safe, predictable, almost insulated from the worst parts of the world. But on a quiet spring morning, something rotten finally surfaced, and at the center of it stood a man everyone thought they knew, Christopher Coleman, the polished head of security for televangelist Joyce Meyer, a church regular, a husband, a father, the kind of man neighbors waved to without a second thought as he headed to work, briefcase in hand, faith on display. But that was only the version he let them see. Behind the mask was another Christopher entirely, the one sending secret messages to a mistress, the one imagining a future where his wife Sherry didn't exist, the one quietly preparing for a life that didn't include the family he photographed on Christmas cards. On May 5th, 2009, the facade began to crack. Christopher called 911 frantic, insisting he couldn't reach his wife or sons. Officers arrived, forced their way inside, and stepped into a scene that felt wrong before they even reached the bedrooms. Sherry, 9-year-old Gavin, and 11-year-old Garrett were found dead, each in their own bed, while spray-painted threats on the walls pointed to a supposed stalker Christopher had reported weeks earlier. But investigators noticed the first hole in the story almost immediately. In the basement, the family dog sat calm and unbothered. If a violent intruder had been inside, why were the only potential witnesses left untouched? The unraveling came fast. Under pressure, Christopher's mistress, Tara Lintz, came forward, revealing their affair. Digital forensics followed, uncovering the emails, the threatening messages Christopher had sent to himself, and the searches, queries about killing methods and life insurance that erased any doubt about intent. At trial, prosecutors drew a chilling portrait of a man so hungry for a new life that he wiped out the one he already had. Even Christopher's own father took the stand, condemning him with a single word: evil. The jury didn't struggle with their decision. In just 4 hours, they returned a verdict of guilt, and Christopher received 3 life sentences without parole. He showed no reaction when the judgment was read, no emotion, no denial. Today, from behind bars, he still claims innocence, but the evidence remains. A man trusted by thousands used that trust as a shield, and when it cracked, the truth was darker than anyone in Columbia, Illinois ever imagined. Melody Ferris. From the outside, they looked like a family who had mastered the American dream. Their Cherokee County estate stretched across 7 quiet acres, a place where success seemed permanent and problems stayed outside the gates. Gary Ferris had built that life himself, and his wife Melody appeared to fit perfectly beside him. But inside that long marriage, something had shifted, subtly at first, then catastrophically. On July 4th, 2018, Gary disappeared. Days later, investigators found his burned remains in a debris pile on the property, and the story Melody offered began to wobble. She said Gary had been drinking, tending a fire, and maybe he'd slipped in. It sounded tragic, but investigators sensed holes from the start. The medical examiner soon confirmed their suspicions. Gary had a gunshot wound, something Melody hadn't mentioned. Cornered, she changed course. Now she said she shot him in self-defense during a heated argument, panicked, and burned the body. But the evidence resisted her version. Prosecutors showed Gary had been shot from behind, undermining any claim of fear or self-preservation. And beneath the polished surface of their long marriage, another picture emerged. Texts documenting family conflict, financial strain, and a household fraying at its edges. What truly turned the case, though, were Melody's choices after Gary's death. She had searched for information about decomposition and quietly siphoned money from shared accounts. By February 2024, after a trial that had the community watching every development, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty of murder and concealing a death. Melody stood motionless as the judge sentenced her to life with the possibility of parole, as if the weight of that moment hadn't reached her yet. Her children sat divided, some defending her, others demanding justice for their father. And as the courtroom emptied, one question lingered in the air. If a marriage of nearly 4 decades could end in such devastation, what would unfold in a case where a young man is accused of erasing both parents in a single devastating act? Brandon Woodruff. His future should have been predictable. Quiet classes, steady routines, the kind of life that drifts forward without incident. But in Tomball, Texas, 24-year-old Brandon Woodruff stepped into a story no one saw coming. One September morning, his parents, Greg and Gwen Woodruff, were found shot to death inside their home. Brandon was the one who dialed 911, insisting he'd simply walked in on the aftermath. Yet from the moment investigators arrived, something in his account didn't sit right. His timeline wobbled. His explanations contradicted themselves. He said he'd been home but somehow heard nothing. Not a struggle, not a sound, which struck detectives as impossible given the violence they believed occurred. Then came the forensic issue. A hammer thought to be handled before the shootings held Brandon's DNA. Still, the case remained frustratingly thin. No eyewitnesses, no confession, no obvious motive that prosecutors could point to with confidence. The case became a lightning rod. Defense attorneys argued the state was stretching coincidence into accusation, that household DNA meant nothing when Brandon lived there. But the unanswered questions lingered. Why were there so many gaps in his story? What pressure point could push an ordinary college student toward killing both his parents? Prosecutors floated ideas, financial strain, rising tension at home. Even so, they admitted their theory leaned heavily on circumstantial threads. In 2009, a jury delivered its verdict, guilty of capital murder, an automatic life sentence without parole. Brandon didn't break down, didn't shout, didn't plead, just absorbed the outcome in a silence that sparked even more debate. Was that the calm of innocence, or the quiet collapse of guilt? To this day, legal experts remain split. Did the system catch a killer, or did it condemn a man without the concrete evidence that justice requires? The Woodruff case shows just how blurred the truth can become in family murders. Sometimes the lies crumble instantly. Other times they stand just long enough to divide everyone who tries to untangle them. Alexander Jackson. The story should have ended with a locked door, a quiet street, and a family settling into the final hours of the year, but instead it opened with a nightmare no one could verify. In Muncie, Indiana, 21-year-old Alexander Jackson told police that a masked gunman had slipped into his suburban home on New Year's Eve 2019, murdering his father Jeffrey, his mother Heidi, and his younger sister Sabrina, while he survived by hiding in a closet. It was a chilling account, the kind that should have pointed detectives toward a dangerous intruder. But almost immediately, the details around him stopped making sense. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing was taken. And Alexander's demeanor was strangely flat for someone claiming to be the lone survivor of a family massacre. Within hours, the intruder story began to unravel. Forensics placed Alexander at each shooting, and gunshot residue was found on his hands. His statements were riddled with contradictions. Timelines that shifted, reactions that didn't match the physical evidence, and explanations that collapsed the moment investigators pressed harder. Prosecutors built their narrative around a young man overwhelmed by pressure, painting him as someone suffocating under expectations he didn't want. They pointed to strained family dynamics, financial friction, and growing resentment. Meanwhile, the defense clung to the intruder theory, insisting police ignored other suspects. But the science wouldn't bend. Ballistics, blood patterns, and DNA all funneled back to Alexander alone. In 2022, he was convicted on 3 counts of murder and sentenced to 195 years in prison, a term that made his future indistinguishable from a life sentence. When given the chance to speak, he repeated his story of the masked killer, a version of events no one in the courtroom believed. Even his extended family split apart, some defending him, others seeking closure. And if Alexander Jackson's collapsing lie about a phantom gunman shook investigators, it raised a darker question. What happens when the next killer isn't even old enough to drive? Carly Madison Gregg. The call came in like a rupture, shattering the quiet of a Mississippi suburb with a teenage girl's frantic plea for help. On March 19, 2024, 14-year-old Carly Madison Gregg told 911 that her mother had been shot inside their Brandon home. When officers rushed to the Gregg residence, they found 40-year-old Ashley Smiley dead from multiple gunshot wounds. Her husband, Heath Smiley, Carly's stepfather, had also been shot but survived, and standing amid the panic and flashing lights was Carly herself. The investigation cut straight to the heart of the truth. Home security footage left no room for doubt. Carly was caught on camera shooting her mother, then ambushing her stepfather when he returned. But the most disturbing revelation came from witnesses. After killing her mother, Carly allegedly invited a friend over and led her to the body, as if the crime were something to display rather than conceal. The motive stunned even seasoned detectives. Carly had been caught with marijuana and expected punishment, a consequence she seemingly decided to preempt with violence. The case sparked a fierce national debate about juvenile justice. How young is too young to be charged with murder? Her defense argued she lacked the developmental maturity to grasp the weight of her actions, citing mental health struggles, her age, and the possibility of rehabilitation. But prosecutors pointed to the calculated nature of the attack. Shooting her mother, lying in wait, attempting to craft an alibi, all signals of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. In September 2024, the jury rejected the insanity claim and found Carly Madison Gregg guilty of murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole. And as the verdict was read, Carly dissolved into tears, confronted for the first time with the enormity of what she had done and what it would cost her. But by then, the damage was irreversible. And if one child turning on a parent is horrifying, what do we make of siblings who take it even further? Robert Bever and Michael Bever. It began like any ordinary July day. Sunlight on the lawn, quiet rooms, a family of 7 going about life as they always had. But inside the Bever home on July 22, 2015, normalcy died. What should have been the harmless noise of a big family became something far darker, as that house turned into the scene of a planned massacre. 18-year-old Robert Bever and 16-year-old Michael Bever had been preparing for months, shaping a plan so cold that even detectives would later struggle to comprehend it. Kill their entire family, then launch a cross-country killing spree to carve their names into infamy. And the frightening part, their plan almost worked. Armed with knives, the brothers attacked their parents, David and April Bever, and their younger siblings. 5 family members were killed, both parents and 3 of the younger children, including 5-year-old Autumn and 7-year-old Christopher. 2 survived. 13-year-old Crystal brutally stabbed but strong enough to alert neighbors, and 2-year-old Autumn found alive in the house. When police arrived, Robert and Michael slipped into the woods behind the home. But their escape didn't last long. Once caught, officers uncovered journals filled with their violent fantasies and their ambition to kill dozens more. The trials only revealed more disturbing details. The brothers were obsessed with serial killers, consumed violent videos constantly, and convinced themselves that a mass killing would grant them lasting fame. Robert appeared to be the leader, but Michael's involvement was just as deliberate. Although the defense argued Michael was controlled by his older brother, prosecutors proved both brothers had planned and executed the murders together. To avoid the death penalty, Robert Bever pleaded guilty and received 5 consecutive life sentences without parole. Michael went to trial, was convicted, and also received life without parole, the judge refusing any leniency because of his age. When Robert was allowed to speak, he showed no remorse at all, choosing instead to complain about his treatment in custody. Michael stayed almost silent, and their surviving sister, Crystal, has spent the years since trying to rebuild a life torn apart by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Christopher and Larissa Rodriguez. They were meant to shield and cherish her. Instead, they crossed a line so dark it stunned an entire community. In Hobbs, New Mexico, 2022, 5-year-old Zoe Pereira didn't disappear in a flash. She faded slowly and silently into a kind of absence that should be impossible in an age where a missing child can trigger nationwide alerts in minutes. By the time police finally opened a case, what they uncovered would stay with even seasoned investigators. Zoe had been buried in a shallow grave, hidden for years, while her parents, Christopher and Larissa Rodriguez, calmly pretended she was living somewhere else. What followed was a descent into pure horror. Detectives pieced together evidence of sustained cruelty, the kind that leaves invisible scars long before any physical ones appear. Zoe had endured starvation, relentless beatings, and conditions so severe they likely contributed to her death. But the brutality didn't end there. Instead of calling for help or showing the smallest spark of humanity, Christopher and Larissa buried their daughter like discarded waste and carried on with their lives. No police reports, no frantic searches, not even concern from relatives they lied to with practiced ease. They simply scrubbed a 5-year-old child from existence. Once confronted, Larissa Rodriguez pleaded guilty to child abuse resulting in death. The agreement spared her the death penalty but locked her into decades behind bars. Christopher Rodriguez faced his own set of charges for both the abuse and the cold, calculated cover-up. In court, the proceedings exposed more than parental cruelty. They revealed failures at every level. Neighbors who heard things and stayed silent, relatives who didn't press harder, and protective systems that somehow missed every warning sign. When the judge delivered Larissa's sentence, she barely reacted. Christopher's case moved forward separately, prosecutors pushing for the harshest punishment possible. One final attempt at justice for a child stripped of every safeguard she should have had. Thomas Mortimer. On the surface, Thomas Mortimer IV had built everything right. Neighbors saw a man who waved hello, mowed his lawn, and lived the quintessential American life. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior, something was collapsing. September 19, 2012 would reveal just how catastrophic that collapse had become. That evening, Thomas didn't just lose control. He obliterated everything he'd built. His wife, Laura, and their 2 young daughters, Kara and Michaela, along with Laura's mother, Pauline, were all shot to death inside their home. 4 lives, extinguished by the one person who should have protected them above all else. When police arrived, they found Thomas sitting outside waiting. No chase, no resistance. Just a man surrounded by the wreckage of his own making. The investigation painted a stark picture: financial ruin. Thomas had been hiding mounting debt, failed business ventures, and accounts drained dry. But prosecutors argued he'd been living a lie for years, keeping up appearances while drowning in obligations he couldn't meet. So when the facade finally cracked, he didn't ask for help or declare bankruptcy. Instead, he chose annihilation. His trial was swift. The evidence overwhelming, and in 2014, Thomas received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. He showed little emotion as the verdict was read, that same blank expression he'd worn when police found him that September night. So while the courtroom erupted with the tears of surviving family members, Thomas remained stone-faced as if already gone from this world. Nicholas Browning. If an adult cracks under pressure, what happens when the violence comes from a child? On February 2, 2008, in Cockeysville, Maryland, the Brownings never believed that they would not celebrate the upcoming Valentine's Day. 16-year-old Nicholas had just returned from a party. His parents, John and Tamara, were asleep, and so were his younger brothers, Gregory and Benjamin. Instead of going to sleep, Nicholas went to his father's closet, retrieved a handgun and a rifle, and methodically moved through the house. One by one, he shot his entire family, and then, as if nothing had happened, he drove back to his friend's house and spent the night. When he returned home the next morning, he called the police, feigning shock and grief. But the performance didn't last long. Investigators quickly unraveled his story and saw through him. There were inconsistencies, then admissions, then the full, horrifying truth. Nicholas confessed to the murders with a disturbing matter-of-factness. He told detectives he'd been thinking about it for some time, that he was tired of his parents' rules and their expectations. But despite his confession, the reasons felt hollow, insufficient to explain such carnage. The trial captivated the nation because Nicholas shattered every assumption about family violence. He wasn't abused. There were no reports of neglect or trauma. By all accounts, he was a bright, well-behaved teenager from a stable, loving home. Teachers liked him. Friends described him as normal. Yet somewhere in that teenage mind, a darkness had taken root that no one saw coming. In 2009, Nicholas Browning pleaded guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to 4 life terms without parole. When given a chance to address the court, he offered apologies that rang hollow to the family members present. But in truth, there was no one left to apologize to. Isabelle Martinez. Isabelle Martinez was a mother of 5 who, by all appearances, struggled but managed. Then came October 16, 2020, a day that would mark one of the most horrific family annihilations in recent Arizona history. Isabelle didn't just harm her family, she systematically killed 4 of her children and her husband. 1 child survived, though the physical and psychological scars would last a lifetime. When officers arrived at the scene, they encountered carnage that even seasoned investigators struggled to process. Isabelle was arrested immediately, covered in evidence of what she'd done, offering no resistance. Bit by it, the details became clear. Each revelation more stomach-turning than the last. But if the murders were horrifying, her courtroom behavior became an entirely different kind of disturbing. During her initial appearances, Isabelle smiled. Not nervous grins or expressions of confusion, but broad, inappropriate smiles that seemed completely disconnected from reality. When asked if she wanted legal representation, she declared loudly that she didn't need a lawyer, that she wanted to represent herself. People couldn't look away from the disconnect between the gravity of her charges and her bizarre effect. But the public saw those smiles and felt a primal revulsion. Isabelle Martinez was found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder in 2023, and she received life sentences for each victim, ensuring she would never walk free. When the verdict was read, that same unsettling smile flickered across her face before disappearing. We may not know the real truth, but what we do know is that her children and husband should be alive today, living their lives chasing dreams. Instead, they're remembered as victims of the person who gave them life. Kamya Gamut. Some cases are remembered for the crime, others for the trial, and then there's Kamya Gamut's case, where the sentencing became more infamous than almost anything that preceded it. In Milwaukee, Wisconsin in 2016, Kamya Gamut was involved in a domestic situation that turned fatal when she killed her partner, Bill Kellerman. The circumstances involved a volatile relationship, accusations of abuse from both sides, and ultimately a violent confrontation that left Bill dead. But prosecutors argued premeditation, while defense attorneys painted a picture of a woman trapped in a cycle of violence who finally snapped. The trial itself followed familiar patterns: testimony, evidence, cross-examination, and Kamya was found guilty of first-degree reckless homicide. Then came the sentencing hearing, and with it, a moment that would be replayed millions of times across news networks and social media. Milwaukee County Circuit Judge Jeffrey Conan took the bench, and what followed was extraordinary. He didn't simply hand down a sentence. He unleashed a verbal barrage unlike anything most court observers had witnessed. In the end, the judge sentenced Gamut to 65 years in prison, yet the sentence itself became secondary to the delivery. Video of Judge Conan's outburst spread rapidly online, dissected and debated. Kamya herself stood mostly silent during the tirade, her expression difficult to read, and when given a chance to speak, she offered little. No tears, no pleas for mercy. Just a woman seemingly resigned to her fate. Ali Abu Laban. He went by the name Jin Kid online and was a TikTok creator who'd built a following doing impressions, particularly of characters from the animated series Skyrim. He seemed charismatic, funny, and talented. But behind the curated posts, however, a far darker reality was unfolding. Ali Abu Laban lived a fairly ordinary life, but his marriage to Anna Abu Laban was deteriorating. Anna asked for separation, a desperate attempt to move on with her life. But Ali couldn't let go. On October 21, 2021, in San Diego, California, Ali had installed a listening device on his daughter's iPad, secretly monitoring Anna's conversations and movements. When he heard her with a man named Rayburn Barron, a friend she'd invited over, Ali's jealousy erupted into violence. He drove to the apartment, entered with a key he'd retained, and shot both Anna and Rayburn to death. The aftermath was captured in disturbing detail. Ali called his mother, confessing what he'd done, and even picked up his daughter from school, still covered in evidence of his crime. When police finally apprehended him, he cooperated, providing a confession that was later played in court. The audio was chilling, his voice casual, almost detached, as he described executing two people. The trial became a media sensation, partly because of Ali's online presence, and the courtroom audio, particularly his confession, went viral, exposing millions to the reality of his violence. 2 years later, Ali was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and he received 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, he showed little reaction, that same detached demeanor from his confession. But in the wake of such pain, the families of Anna and Rayburn mourned the death of their loved ones, who were killed for the crime of existing. Jake and Angela Wagner. On the night of April 21st and 22nd, 2016, a massacre so methodical was executed that it took years to unravel. 8 members of the Roden family were murdered in their homes in 3 separate locations, but all within hours. Some were shot multiple times as they slept, and others showed signs they'd tried to defend themselves. 3 young children were left alive, witnesses to the aftermath, if not the murders themselves. The scale was unprecedented. The crime scene spanned multiple properties, and the investigation involved hundreds of law enforcement officers from multiple agencies. For 2 years, no arrests were made. The Pike County community lived in fear, wondering who could have done this and whether they'd strike again. Then came the breakthrough: the Wagner family. Jake Wagner had previously been in a relationship with Hannah Mae Roden, with whom he shared a daughter. Custody disputes had grown increasingly bitter, and investigators eventually uncovered evidence suggesting the Wagner family, including Jake, his brother George, and their parents Angela and George Billy Wagner III, had spent months planning the murders, motivated by custody concerns and a web of grievances against the Rodens. When the arrests came in 2018, it shocked the community. This wasn't a stranger, a drifter passing through. These were neighbors, people the Rodens had known. The Wagners had allegedly purchased weapons, studied the Roden properties, coordinated their movements, and systematically executed 8 people to resolve a custody dispute. The legal proceedings stretched across years, but in 2021, George Wagner IV went to trial and was convicted on 8 counts of aggravated murder, receiving 8 consecutive life sentences. His brother Jake had already pleaded guilty in 2021, accepting 8 consecutive life terms in exchange for testifying against his family. When Jake entered his plea, he read a statement describing his role in the murders with chilling detail. Their mother, Angela Wagner, pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including aggravated murder and conspiracy, receiving 30 years to life, and the father, Billy Wagner, was convicted in 2022 and sentenced to life without parole, narrowly avoiding the death penalty. Although the punishment fit the crime, it could not reverse the loss of an entire family. Ronald Lee Haskell. Summer evenings in Spring, Texas usually passed quietly, but July 9, 2014 was different. When the doorbell rang at the Stay family home, no one suspected the man in the FedEx uniform standing outside was there to execute them. Ronald Lee Haskell had traveled from California with a singular, horrifying purpose: to murder his ex-wife's family members who had sheltered her during their divorce. Ronald forced his way inside and bound the parents of his ex-wife, Stephen and Katie Stay, along with their children. What followed was methodical and merciless. He shot them one by one. 6 people. Stephen, Katie, and 4 of their children died in their own home. But 15-year-old Cassidy Stay survived by playing dead, a bullet having grazed her head. The moment Haskell left, she called 911, delivering information that would lead to his capture within hours. That call, detailed despite unimaginable trauma, became evidence that haunted courtrooms and television screens. Cassidy identified her attacker, described his vehicle, and warned that he planned to target more family members. Police intercepted Ronald before he could continue his rampage, and during his trial, prosecutors revealed a man consumed by rage over his failed marriage, willing to annihilate an entire family to punish his ex-wife. The jury sentenced him to death in 2019. But Ronald showed no remorse after his sentence was passed. His cold demeanor throughout the proceedings shocked those who watched. In contrast, Cassidy's courage stood out with her public speech about forgiveness and healing, her strength becoming the lasting image from a case defined by senseless violence. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.